Hello team and welcome to a very late night ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. Ukraine War Frontline update for it's now the 6th of January 2024. It was the 5th of January until rather recently. It's probably an ill-advised video. I've watched a bunch of episodes of Reacher Season 2 with my partner. She's gone to bed and I played a game of Fortnite with one of my twin boys. Hey, squad of 4, we got Victory Royale, so went and played a bit of World of Tanks with him as well, and then thought, right, I really should do this mapping because, do you know what, JR's done the mapping. I've added a bit to it because Syriac Maps has now updated some since JR did it. You can check out what the lines mean on the screen right now. Pause the video if you don't know what they mean. But let's go to the northeastern sector, or access from Kupiansk to Svatova to Crimea. Hopefully I make sense. I've had a bottle of wine. These things happen on a Friday night, so, you know, sorry, not sorry. So there is a lot of talk, and indeed I think the Daily Telegraph had something written on this today. I have got somewhere that the Russians are preparing for a major attack in the Kupiansk direction. We've seen a lot of activity around Sinkivka recently. There's been a lot of footage of lost Russian columns and equipment around there. It's been really costly for them. So we might worry that the Russians are building up for a massive attack in this area, musical references notwithstanding. But on the other hand, we have also heard the Russians say this an awful lot about this particular area. So this is not an uncommon claim. It might be that we can just take it with a huge pinch of salt, what they're claiming, and that well, if you remember, over the months, over the last year, there's been a lot of talk about, oh, there's 100,000 troops, 120,000 troops in this entire area. Then there was a lot of caveats applied to that, which was, okay, well, actually, most of them appear to be sort of training. They might not all be frontline troops. In fact, there's probably only, you know, X tens of thousands of frontline troops. All these different claims going on both sides, and consistent worries about big Russian attacks in this northeastern area. But actually, we haven't really seen them. What we are seeing is some movement further down to the south near Terny in that direction, this salient here that has been enlarged, and the Russians have pushed here. Although I was listening to Andrew Perpetua's live stream just now, actually, in doing a little bit of research for this, and there might well be quite a lot of equipment lost for the Russians there. There are some Stridsvarn 122, I think the Leopard 2A, the Leopard 2 Swedish variant, a couple of these lost around here. Got to be careful. The Russians claim 4 were lost, but it was 2 tanks that was just filmed from 2 different angles, both of them. So the claims were 4 tanks lost. It appears to just be 2. Not quite sure what was going on there, but anyway, there's quite a bit of activity in that particular area, but no changes to the front line other than, well, there's no changes there, to be honest, with those mappers, but that has shifted in the last few days. Other than that, you know, fairly stable along this front line, but, you know, with the worries that the Russians might well be gathering for a big attack. Make of that what you will. Then we come on down past the Seversk front line to the northern Bakhmut area, and in fact just north of Bakhmut. As you can see here, some Russian gains, slight Russian gains, as according to Deep State maps here, just around the Kromova area. If we go a little bit north from there and see this 00506 highway coming into the northwest of Bakhmut, Andrew Perpetua was talking about quite a lot of activity going on here, and actually that the Russians might be pushing forward a little bit uphill in this direction, but the other side of the road, the Ukrainians might have a few, you know, they might control this tree line as opposed to it being grey zone. It's just a little bit dynamic here that the Ukrainians are pushing back, the Russians are pushing as well. But as with everywhere along the front line, there are worries from Ukrainian soldiers, lots of concerns about a lack of ammunition, a lack of artillery ammunition. You know, things are difficult for the Ukrainians as they are pretty exhausted in terms of the troops themselves, but also exhausting their resources of weaponry. So, there are those claims that are fairly consistent with soldiers, aren't they? Soldiers are never happy, right? They're never like, yeah, we've got everything we need. It's trying to work out what is the usual kind of complaint, and then what is there an endemic problem for the Ukrainians in terms of where they're at. On the other hand, the Russians have been trying to push across the railway line in Klishchivka north of there, and they have been suffering some fairly heavy losses in so doing. So it's all, I guess, on the one hand, is it dynamic? Or is it just stasis with quite a lot of losses, potentially for either side there? So that's the kind of Bakhmut situation. We'll move on further to the south now. Between Bakhmut and Avdiivka, as we come down to the south, I'm not referring to the ISW. They haven't got their report out already. Normally they'd have it out by now, so it's a bit later than normal. So I was hoping to dip into a fresh ISW Institute for Study of War report, but it's not there. But there is a lot of Russian shelling going on in this area, and aviation strikes. And Andrew was saying, I'm not quite sure what this signifies. My thoughts would be that we have heard that they stopped using aviation around here due to the plane being downed around Mariupol, another one possibly around Yeisk. So there were rumours of air defences possibly being active there. We saw aviation guided glide bombs being used less around the Krinky area and Dnipro River Delta because they lost the 3 Su-34 airframes around here because of supposedly the Patriot system there. So it could be that this is simply a safe place for them to use their airframes, that they're fairly confident that there isn't a Patriot system planted around here and they can hammer this area. And so it could be that, right, we've got the planes, we've got the bombs, where can we safely use these planes and bombs to hit? And it could just be that this is an optimal position. I don't know. Or it could be something more operationally significant and they're softening it up for wanting to move forward. Not 100% sure. As we come further to the south to the Avdiivka area, you can see that there are some blue pins here. So if we go to Suryat maps to see what this is just the catch up in Serebryensky forest. That is a change they've got in their tweet, but I actually showed that in the map changes yesterday. They just didn't have the tweet to go alongside with that, but they talked about during the last 48 hours the Russian army advanced in the forest, taking control of a series of positions of the Ukrainian army. So we're going to move to this map for Suryat maps, pro-Russian mapper to remind you, and they say the Russian army advances 800 meters south of Vasily, which is this area there by the water treatment plant and sort of east of Terrakon, that slag heap that's there. So continuing to advance in that area. On the other hand, corrections were made in the axis of Ocheretberna. So as ever with Suryat maps, you're not quite sure what is going on with the language. Corrections is like, okay, we got it wrong. Either you were wrong and you were overzealous, or the Ukrainians have made a counterattack and they've advanced in the area. But probably it's more likely that they were just overzealous, but of course they don't want to admit that. It's just, corrections being made, and that's it. A very neutral kind of statement about the fact that, do you know what, they were unreliable in their initial claims. Nonetheless, it is fairly challenging in that area, and in fact, Andrew Perpetua is talking about the Russians pushing on in that area and having some success as they move into this particular area of tree lines. It could even be a cemetery there that the Russians are pushing towards. His opinion is that this does the same sort of thing as pushing directly to the west through Stepova and Bodichi. It just takes a lot longer. It's the same eventuality of cutting off the supply roads that feed Avdiivka. Yeah, quite. Yeah, I can go along with that. But yeah, I'm less concerned about movements in that direction. I would be more concerned about the Russians pushing through Stepova and towards Bedici, because I think that spells the end of Avdiivka in terms of you're really closing off the neck of the cauldron there. But the Ukrainians appear to be able to withstand the Russian pressure in that particular part of the Avdiivka front. The question is whether the Ukrainians are really going to push back in a counterattack, or whether they are essentially allowing the Russians to take Avdiivka. Just eventually, they're just going to bleed the Russians for as much as they can. I don't know whether they fully made that decision, because if they had made that decision, you would expect a counterattack to have taken place in a major way. Maybe they are gathering forces and equipment to do that. I don't know, but I think it's interesting to see what the Ukrainians decide with regard to Avdiivka going forward. What are their goals here? Yes, one of the main goals is going to be preserving human life, but there's also strategic value or sort of operational value to Avdiivka in enabling the Ukrainians to hit Donetsk city to the southeast with artillery more easily, and so on and so forth. So I don't know. We'll see what happens there. A couple of other things to say about Avdiivka is that in order to counterattack in the whole general sector, the Ukrainians, I think, would prefer to attack to the north. I've said previously that if we go into the 3D here, attacking from the south and trying to retake ground, coming back down into, I guess, Severny, or they already control Severny, but back down into Vodyani and Opitny, you can see it's just really quite flat around here. And so both sides find it difficult, I think, to advance, because it's open ground and you are easily viewed by drones and spotters, and you can be hit by artillery, by ATGMs, obviously heavily mined as well, and mortars and whatnot. So I think this is a really difficult area for either side to attack. And if the Ukrainians are going to counterattack, I don't think this would be the easiest place to do it. I mean, you could try and take this whole area. They had previously been trying to push along here, and we can see a couple of pins for Deep State Map to show that the Ukrainians have gained a tiny bit of ground around there, unless that's rejigging, I'm not sure. If you were going to amass troops to attack somewhere, you could try and take this whole area, maybe by cutting through to the south of the water features. But realistically, I think the north is going to be preferable to do this. There is some topography that you could take into account. So we go to this other side of Krasnohorivka, and Andrew Perpetua did this on his live stream. You can see that actually, just this side of Krasnohorivka, it is higher ground, and if the Ukrainians can get here to alongside this road, they could have some joy in attacking Krasnohorivka from the high ground. So that would be probably a preferable option than trying to go it across the flat ground to the south. So my guess is that it will be pushing this way, and yeah, trying to cut off this whole salient from maybe down this road. But you would need just an awful lot of troops in order to do that, and I don't think the Ukrainians have particularly got that. They haven't got the ammunition, the equipment, really. So what do the Ukrainians do? On the other hand, it's not that the Russians have an endless supply of personnel and equipment. Avdiivka has been hugely costly for them, and to think that they can easily continue advancing here, well, they haven't done so. It's been incredibly difficult for them to advance. Every meter of ground is costing them dearly, and so it's not easy for either side. It's a difficult area, that's for sure. And just finally, there apparently over the last few days there have been some attacks in the from the Kamyanka area from the Russians. So some big activity around here. There's no changes to the mapping at the moment, but there might well be in the next 24 hours or so. We can see that the Russians, as according to Syriac maps, have advanced as already mentioned in this area just to the east of the water treatment plant, with deep state maps having some gains to take the water treatment plant into account. That's catching up with Syriac maps, what they had claimed previously. So that's not necessarily that the deep state mapping change has been over the last 24 hours, but certainly a lot of activity here, and likewise around Kamyanka. Right, moving on. Although just before we do move south, it's worth noting, and again, Andrew talks about this with his team, that in this whole area, in the Avdiivka area particularly, but even going a little further, so if you talk about this whole area there, over the last week, although some of the footage might be from earlier, the Russians have lost a lot of equipment. I've shown you, or at least I've referenced some of these in my news videos, the first news video of the day. Each day for the last sort of week, there have been references to bits of kit that have been blown up, some 240mm mortars, some tulips, a tulip and a loader next to it, and grad launchers around here. So this has been an expensive area for the Russian artillery, and then you wonder then what effect that will have on their ability to commit to further offensives if they can't support their infantry as easily with artillery, because it's been degraded. So that's it's not to be shrugged off. That is potentially significant that Ukrainians have been able to do some decent degrading of Russian artillery there. Right, now finally let's move towards Mariinka. Now there's not actually much to say about Mariinka. It seems to be somewhat, I don't know if it's stabilized, but there's just not been any movement to the defensive lines of the Russians, even though they're on the offensive, but the lines I have on the map there. If we come further to the south, some interesting, again, commentary by Andrew Perpetua and his team about Novomikhailivka. I mean, the first thing is that he's really impressed that they've stabilized, the Ukrainians have stabilized the line here. This is very similar to what I was just saying about the area to the south of Avdiivka in this Vodyanya or Pitny area where they're trying to move north, the Russians, and it's flat and they just get absolutely hammered whenever they try to do that. Well, actually, that's fairly similar in this Novomikhailivka area, where the area to the south is pretty flat and large fields. And this is actually supposedly an easier route to attack than to the north, which is very, very heavily fortified. So the Russians are doing the more sensible thing here, but unfortunately for them, it makes them easy targets, and they have lost tremendous amounts of vehicles here. Just tremendous amounts. So Andrew Perpetua in his video showed this, right? But here, like, if you look at those pins there's about 6 pins on top of each other. So it doesn't really do justice to the number of pins that are on this screen, right? Like here, there's a good 10 pins, and they're all just loaded on top of each other there and here. So they have lost an awful lot. And then he reckons, and he says it's not an exaggeration, but he thinks that they are missing about 100 vehicles in this area. He says that there hasn't been clear satellite imagery for a long time. There's a lot of clouds in this neck of the woods, and so it's difficult for him to get imagery. But also further to the south than here, so that is stopping around here, that image that I screen grabbed. But then down here, there's just an absolute ton of lost equipment there as well. So it's just like the whole area is another example of equipment graveyards. So, if you think about equipment graveyards, this is one of them. You've got Vuhledar, where they lost 130 plus pieces of equipment. You've got Avdiivka area, where it's just hundreds and hundreds of pieces of equipment. You have potentially around here, talk about quite a bit of equipment lost there, and then Sinkivka particularly recently, an awful lot of equipment, and then you've got Krinky, where there's claims of anywhere between 100 and 200 pieces of equipment lost just around this area. You just start adding this up, and goodness me, it's a phenomenal amount of stuff that the Russians have lost in taking what is, in a grand scheme of things, very minimal amount of ground. There are pins on the map, and the Russians are making consistent advances, but as I said the other day, if they want to advance to Transnistria, I mean, Bakhmut is the equivalent of that tiny area there. Well, if it's not even their maximalist gains, their maximalist objective, if they just want to reach Transnistria, it's going to take them forever and more equipment than they have. We need to keep an eye on the macro. And not just look at the individual fields and tree lines and so on and so forth. Anyway, as we move round the corner, come past Velika Novosilka and come to Robotina, there isn't too much to report about in this Zaporizhia front line. So there isn't too much really to report. No changes to the mapping at all along this Zaporizhia front line, Donetsk into Zaporizhia, and indeed into Kherson and down the Dnipro River. Just a few things, I guess, to mention concerning Krinky, where, like I've just said, there's just a huge number of Russian vehicles that have been destroyed. If you come across to Kazachi Lahiri around here, I think around this road there, where Magyar's released some videos, his Eagles, he has a drone unit. There are other drone units operating in the area, but his one has been particularly fruitful in taking out Russian equipment, and plenty of videos. P-Style11 here says General Staff, within 24 hours, they repulsed 6 Russian, what he says, meat assaults by the Russians on the left bank of the Dnipro. An example of one of the latter is in this video. Magyar, the remnants of the 810th, are already refusing to storm Krinky, abandoning some new ones who are not familiar with the real situation. So that's his opinion. But this video is really interesting, shows destruction of a bunch of equipment and people fleeing off the top of the vehicles, and some engineers, I think, come to fix them. And anyway, it all ends with destruction of a lot of kit, right? Usual kind of stuff, but quite an interesting watch, actually, to be fair. And then there's this rather bizarre one of a drone that drops some kind of very large explosive. I mean, something that we might not have seen before, some kind of big tube. And I think that might be the one, actually, with the engineers coming to fix it. Anyway, the equipment there is just blown to smithereens. I think a Bukanka van disassembles itself over quite a large area, as well as, just again, in this particular neck of the woods, the Russians are losing a lot of equipment. The drone units here are being incredibly efficient in taking out Russian units, and that is probably having this knock-on effect on morale, refuseniks not wanting to attack what is actually a very small Ukrainian bridgehead. But as we've heard, I think this morning I reported again, or it might have been yesterday actually, further reports of electronic warfare advantages for the Ukrainians in the area, drone advantages for them as well. And that translates into a loss of equipment, a lack of morale, issues for the Russian soldiers, and then refusing to attack, so on and so forth. Having said that, it's not going to be nice to be the Ukrainian units that are having to hold this Krinky bridgehead, because it is fairly sacrificial as far as I can work out, and which is why you've seen things like the New York Times article reporting from the troops' point of view on the ground that it's fairly suicidal. Of course, when you take a bigger picture look at what's going on, then, sadly enough, those troops are probably being used instrumentally to bring about a greater gain in terms of fixing the Russian troops in the area, getting them to continually try and take out those troops in the bridgehead, but in so doing lose a lot of equipment themselves and a lot of personnel. So that's my reading of that particular area, where we are seeing attrition rates that are favourable to the Ukrainians, as we are seeing in places like Avdiivka. It's not to say that it's like that all across the front line, but there's several hotspots where the Russians are being made to really work for those gains. They are making gains, but it comes at quite a cost. And that's pretty much that for the frontline update tonight. Sorry if I've garbled most of what I've tried to tell you. I need to go to bed. Take care. Speak soon. Probably too soon. Toodle pips.